We invite you to listen to the discussions recorded during the Warsaw European Conversation, an annual conference by Polityka Insight and the European Council on Foreign Relations. In 5 episodes, we discuss Europe's readiness for war, digital sovereignty, the competitiveness of the EU economies, European elections, and energy policy. In today's episode, we will be discussing this year's elections in Hungary, Germany, and France. In recent years, mainstream parties in many European countries have come under increasing pressure, while the far right has been gaining ground in elections. Will this trend continue in 2026? My name is Tomasz Sawczuk. I am a Senior Analyst for Public Policy and European Affairs at Polityka Insight. In today's episode, in 3 conversations, I will speak with Peter Kreko about the April elections in Hungary, with Celia Belin about the consequences of the March local elections in France, and with Jakub Ross about the significance of this year's state elections in Germany. Enjoy the podcast. Peter Kreko is a director of Political Capital Institute in Budapest. Welcome to Polityka Insight's podcast.
Thank you.
We are speaking just weeks before the parliamentary elections in Hungary on 12th of April. According to recent public opinion polls, the opposition TISA party, led by Péter Magyar, has a solid 10% or even more lead over the ruling Fidesz party, led by Viktor Orbán, who has been prime minister for past 16 years. So let me begin with this. Are these polls reliable? Is Orbán actually in danger?
First of all, thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm glad to be able to participate on the event and also to be able to discuss these issues here in the podcast. And this is an absolutely relevant question because 4 years ago, in 2022, at the parliamentary elections, while most of the polls well predicted that Fidesz is going to win the election, but almost none of the polls have predicted that he's going to win with a landslide, with a constitutional majority, with 2/3, more than 50% of the votes. And what seemed to be the case 4 years ago is that the polls underestimated a bit the support of the Fidesz, the pro-governmental camp, and a bit overestimated the opposition camp. It's quite counterintuitive, right? That after back then 12, right now 16 years of governance, it might happen that voters are more reluctant to tell their governmental than their opposition attitudes, but it might sound a bit counterintuitive because we would expect that typically after a long rule, the opposition voters against the government are more shy to admit their preferences than governmental ones. But even if we think that it might be the case this time as well, why? Because there is definitely huge hype against the new opposition party. And also the public mood is not very good in Hungary. So being a pro-governmental voter is maybe less fashionable than it was before. Even if we calculate with this factor, even if we calculate with the gerrymandered constituency map, even if we calculate with maybe a bit of vote buying, it seems that currently, if we calculate an average of the most reliable polls, the gap between Fidesz and TISA seems to be around 10% or even more. It would lead to a significant victory of the opposition party, even if with not a huge margin, but with a convincing margin. So because of the fact that averages and not only a single poll indicate that TISA is about to win the election if things remain unchanged, and all other indicators seem to point towards this fact. So in short, even if we think that polls are not entirely accurate, it would be very difficult to assume that all polls are wrong and that Fidesz is ahead of TISA in reality.
Can you describe Magyar's political agenda and his election campaign? What are his strengths and weaknesses so that it makes him a frontrunner?
What is exciting about the current electoral campaign in Hungary is that the topics of the two sides are entirely different. So Péter Magyar is very consciously focusing on domestic issues, inflation, economic situation, healthcare, corruption. And according to the polls, these are the issues that the voters are the most concerned about. On the other hand, the government and the Fidesz campaign probably will be difficult to persuade the voters that they have been so successful on the policy field in the last 16 years. The economy is stagnating, a bit declining. The healthcare is increasingly bad shape, and generally voters seem to be dissatisfied with how things are managed in the country. So they bring the whole campaign into this level of the geopolitics. And I think it is the only country where you can hear this message in this sharp manner, is that Hungary is under threat of being attacked not only symbolically, but literally as well by Ukraine and by Brussels as well. I think the advantage of Péter Magyar when it comes to political topics is exactly that he could put together a campaign that is rather disciplined in focusing on domestic political issues, because incumbents in general and Orbán in particular seem to have more experience, therefore more advantage on the geopolitical and foreign policy front.
You've mentioned that Orbán claims that if the opposition wins, they would drag Hungary into war. How successful is this narrative? Do people actually believe that this is a real threat?
According to a poll that has been published a few weeks ago, about 1/4 of the electorate believed that if the opposition will be on power, then Hungary can be pulled into a war. But also another 1/4 of the population have been undecided about this question, which means that this is a message that might be important on the day of the election. What is, on the other hand, seem to be a lack of success and a failure on the side of the governmental campaign is that as we approach the elections, and it's only 2 weeks to go, the gap between Fidesz and Tisza that we have discussed, so that's almost 10% average difference, and Tisza is leading the polls, so it doesn't seem to close. Fidesz could not improve its ratings in the last few months, which indicate that maybe this strong and only geopolitical focus in their campaign is not necessarily a winning strategy. Of course, it can be a winning strategy if something unexpected happens in the campaign. And according to investigative journalists at Washington Times, at Financial Times and other outlets, there are strong plans and already practices by Russia to interfere into the campaign. According to Washington Post, for example, Kremlin have considered a fake assassination attempt against Viktor Orbán exactly because they felt that he is on the losing side and he is about to lose the elections if things become as they are and something unprecedented have to happen. But if there will be no huge shocks that totally change the campaign topics and dynamics in the next 2 weeks, what we see at the moment is that the chances of the opposition to win the elections are rather on the rise and not that much on the decline. And one more point, I think the power of journalism and investigative journalism when it comes to Russian influence might be visible here, because the more attention is focusing on malevolent Russian interference activities into the Hungarian elections, the more difficult it will be to make them happen. So I think it can also prevent Hungary for being some kind of test ground of Russian active measures.
Would you say that this campaign is a clash between general visions for Hungary, or are there also some central policy points or electoral promises that are being discussed?
The opposition and Péter Magyar and his TISZA party almost only focusing on policy issues. They have published a long electoral manifesto, quite rich in details, in figures and promises. They would like to steer the public discourse towards policies, towards specific policy issues and their solution, including healthcare, education, including how to improve ways of living and so on. On the governmental side, I think we more see this general populist strategy of talking about symbolic issues and talking about gigantic geopolitical trends instead of everyday concerns. What we can tell for sure is that if TISZA is elected, it might have an impact in certain policy fields, healthcare and so on. But more importantly, especially in this podcast, the foreign policy line of the Hungarian government can change quite spectacularly. So even if the opposition does not promise a U-turn in foreign policy. They say, for example, that like the current government, they would not support a fast-track accession of Ukraine to the European Union. They also say that they would not make a U-turn when it comes to their Russia policy, even if they would like to reduce their independence. So they nuance their messages, but generally the line of TISZA communication when it comes to EU, when it comes to NATO, when it comes to Russia is starkly different than from what Fidesz represents. And given that TISZA is a member of the European People's Party, I would assume that a more mainstream, more orthodox foreign policy line with less obstructionism, less vetoism, and maybe a more silent support of Ukraine can be expected. In other policy fields, we can definitely expect some change. And also we have a good reason to assume that, like it happened in Poland, the new incoming government would receive the EU funds as well that can help them to deliver some of their promises, but generally there are policy monologues in Hungary. So the opposition is talking about policies, the governmental side is only talking about politics and geopolitics.
Viktor Orban has received support from the US President Donald Trump as well as from some other European politicians on radical right. How significant is this in practice?
Good question. The message of Orban is that he is a world-class foreign policy player who is endorsed not only by his comrades within the European Union, but has good relationship with the current US administration, with Vladimir Putin, with Xi Jinping. I think we have to give Orban a credit in the sense that rarely a Central Eastern European country receives such foreign policy attention. Exactly. And this is partially because he could position himself as this outlier in European and NATO politics. When it comes to the general perception of competence and ability to govern, it seems that Péter Magyar, the opposition leader, and Orban are more or less perceived as similarly competent. But when it comes to foreign policy, of course, Orban definitely has some advantage. So far, though, it seemed to be that voters are not turning towards Fidesz in great numbers because of this huge international fireworks before the election. GD Vance will come to Budapest soon, but I also do not expect that it is going to be a game changer. So far, Orban has been rather unsuccessful, I think, in making foreign policy as the central issue of the campaign. And if Fidesz loses elections, then the geopolitics of that will be definitely exciting, because this is an election where it's not just Russian President Vladimir Putin who have endorsed Viktor Orban, but the US President Donald Trump as well. And while both the United States, of course, with much more visible tools, and Russia provide some help in the Fidesz campaign, so far it could not improve the popularity ratings of Fidesz and Orbán.
Let me ask you this, and this will be a question somewhat about the Hungarian political order, how it works currently. What if Magyar wins? I mean, in Poland, the transition after 8 years of law and justice in power has been a bumpy road, and many legal and political issues are still unresolved. But in Hungary, Orbán has been prime minister for 16 years, and he was also able to amend the constitution, which was not something Jarosław Kaczyński could do. So what would this mean for Magyar in power?
I think the Polish parallel is absolutely justified. And yes, for Magyar, an absolute majority, but not a constitutional majority. A constitutional majority is a 2/3 majority, which seems highly unlikely at the moment, even while TISA is improving its results. So an absolute majority would be a very bumpy road, as you said. He has to govern against a very hostile institutional environment. So the chief prosecutor's office, that can be extremely important in corruption-related investigations. The constitutional court, that can block legislative action. The president, the fiscal council, they together can make passing the budget practically impossible. And a whole lot of other institutions can block the action and the plans of the next TISA government. But I think at the same time shouldn't underestimate the political opportunism of some players that are sitting in so-called independent institutions and currently seemingly having rock-solid loyalty towards Viktor Orbán. If TISA wins rather convincingly, and the public mood will be that Fidesz might lose even more support in the future, and also Orbán's myth that he is the one who is always winning the election. So if it disappears, if it crumbles, then I can easily imagine that many of the institutions and their members will consider it to make more nuanced decisions, to distance themselves from Orbán, to distance themselves from Fidesz, and not just behave the way their original loyalties would predict. So in short, I do think that if TISA wins the election, it might lead to consequences in this hostile institutional environment as well that we do not see at the moment. I don't think that we can predict easily the real nature and unfolding of a governmental change. And while in Poland, correct me if I'm wrong, most of the important reform plans of the government could be blocked by the president.
Correct.
In Hungary, this is a more diverse set of institutes, and I'm not entirely sure that the plans of Orbán for going into possibly opposition and then shipwreck the next Magyar government and then come back as the savior. So I'm not entirely sure that you can turn this plan into reality. So will Orbán, if defeated, be a leader like Fico, like Trump, who then returns even stronger, or will be he someone like Bolsonaro, who is disqualified from future politics? We just can't tell it at the moment.
Well, in any case, the 12th of April will be a big day in European politics. Let's see what happens. Thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Celia Belin is the head of the European Council on Foreign Relations Bureau in Paris. She's an expert in French and American politics. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
We are talking shortly after the March local elections in France. So let's discuss the results of the vote, but more importantly, what they mean for French politics, especially before the looming 2027 presidential elections. What are your key takeaways from the results?
This election was taking place a year before the presidential election that will designate a successor to the 10 years of Emmanuel Macron. So the political atmosphere is very tense at the moment, and quite a few parties were hoping that this municipal local elections would give a sense of who's winning, who's in front. And by and large, the results are quite inconclusive because all of the 5 major forces currently at the moment, the 2 extremes, left and right, the 2 centrist, center-left, center-right, and the absolute center, extreme center, which is the Macron party, all of them are claiming that they have won. Maybe just Macron's party is the weakest part, but all of them are claiming they've won, and they have arguments for sort of winning in old fashion. But what it means is that no one's won, no one is ahead to prepare for 2027.
So let's discuss them one by one then. Let's begin with Marine Le Pen's national rally. You've mentioned that they claim that they won local elections in France. Why do they say this? And what should we note about the rally's performance?
What we've noticed is that there has been a form of anchoring for National Rally in local elections for the fact that they have been able to move from about 20 municipalities back 6 years ago to now about 70 municipalities directly under their leadership, which is not very many though. So it just means that National Rally has been credible enough for part of the electorate to be able to get re-elected. They have a high incumbency rate. Many of them have been re-elected, such as Louis Alliot in Perpignan. They have found difficult to make new conquests. What's happened, though, is that now they are more and more the first opposition party in many of those municipalities, such as in Marseille, where the socialists have ended up prevailing, but now National Rally is the second force. So for such an insurgent radical right party, it is important that now they are increasingly seen as the alternative to anyone who's in power, and this has been confirmed with these elections.
They compete not only with the Macron's camp, but also with the center-right, the Republicans. So what are the implications of the elections for the relationship between the more traditional right-wing parties and this new alt-right or populist right party?
For Les Républicains, which is a party that is hesitating between a center-right band and a hard-right band, this moment is particularly difficult because they have to decide whether or not they want to unite with National Rally, and the party is split. We've seen the split in 2024 when the head of Les Républicains, Éric Ciotti, decided a month before the snap elections called by Macron to join forces with Marine Le Pen's National Rally. And what happened then is that the Républicains were cut in half, less than half, for the Éric Ciotti side, for the RN-favored side, but there was deep divisions within the party. And these divisions still prevail today because Éric Ciotti, this Republican who has made that choice to go with the National Rally, has just won in a massive way in Nice. He now represents, for some, the example of what the hard right should be now, something in between the traditional right and the National Rally, and using this insurgent radical right moment to get elected. But the center right also still believes that the pathway to the presidency, to governing, has to stand more responsibly in the middle of the right-wing political spectrum, taking back electorate out away from Macron, and hope that this will get them to the Élysée Palace. So I think we have 1 year to see how this internal struggle within the right features and what kind of candidate do they put forward in a year.
If you were to guess, which of these urges is stronger?
The split is inevitable. So you will have, Les Républicains has an enormous struggle at the moment. And what I would imagine is that a part of them may join Édouard Philippe, who comes from the center but sits on the center right, or Gérald Darmanin, who's Minister of Justice under Macron's government and sits again in the center right. And the other part will definitely go with the National Rally. This is where the energy is on those two sides rather than sitting with them at the moment.
So let's now discuss the left. It seems that the socialists did fairly well in the elections. They won Paris, obviously, among other places. And there's also been a discussion on whether the parties of the left should cooperate more closely with the far-right France Unbound by Jean-Luc Mélenchon. So what are the takeaways from these left-wing parties at the moment?
Yeah, socialists are claiming victory in three major cities, Paris, Lyon, and Marseille. All three of them, they were able to retain power. Actually, Lyon is an alliance with the Greens, is a Green candidate, together also with France Insoumise, France Unbound, versus Paris, where Emmanuel Grégoire, who is the successor to Anne Hidalgo, as mayor of Paris, decided not to join forces with Jean-Luc Mélenchon's far-left party. It's the parallel story of Les Républicains story. Within the Socialist Party, you have also a meltdown over whether to work with Jean-Luc Mélenchon's France Unbound. Now, experts are starting to dig into the numbers because what happened is twofold. Some socialist candidate decided to unite with France Insoumise, with the radical left, and others decided against it. People looking at the numbers are starting to see that the places where they united, they sort of underperformed, and the places where they stayed on their own, they performed at least the same way. And mostly what's happened is not that socialist electorate would not vote for the France Insoumise, is that the alliance with the radical left has prompted a response from the right against it. Mobilization on the right create a barrage, or a wall, a firewall against the Unbound France candidates. That's what the radical left is serving at the moment. It is a very useful movement for National Rally, for Républicains, as a foil, as something that you get your electorate excited about, something you have to reject, and something that gets you to the polls. So we've seen that by and large in those municipal elections.
So would you say that in practice, the alliance with the far left is more toxic for a mainstream voter than the alliance with the far right?
Well, that's all brand new. It's really difficult for me to say right now, but that is definitely the trend. That is where we're going. Yet, only in 2024, just 2 years ago, the firewall against National Rally was stronger than the firewall against France Insoumise. But for National Rally and their allies on the right, it has been relentless strategy to try to make the radical left the new demonized party in the political spectrum. France Insoumise has played into this hand for their own strategic reason. They are very unruly. They are creating scandals, and political competition and radical activism is part of their brand. And so while National Rally all these years have tried to behave as if they were the responsible ones, as if they were the credible ones. So each one of the two sides have their own strategy, which plays into this reversal of rejection, which means that in 2027, it is possible to see that the candidate that's rejected with Republican firewall against it is Jean-Luc Mélenchon and not Marine Le Pen or Jordan Bardella anymore.
Okay, so we should now discuss the state of Macronism after the elections. You've mentioned that the Macron's camp is the only one that maybe not so much claims that they won the elections. Is it fair to say that the results confirm the collapse of centrist politics in France?
The collapse of centrist policies has been a long time coming. It's almost started the day after Emmanuel Macron was re-elected in 2022. He was re-elected, only a couple of months after the Ukraine war started, at a moment and only 2 years after the start of the COVID crisis, at a moment when the French were looking for steady leadership, presidential leadership, because the challenger making it to second round was, again, Marine Le Pen, coming from the radical right. And so there was still a rallying effect around Emmanuel Macron. But he did not have that much of a mandate. It was proven by the fact that the legislative elections that took place right after did not produce an absolute majority for his party, but was the start of a sort of a crumbling of his power. These have been confirmed 2 years later by the European elections, which he lost, and then immediately after that by snap elections that he called himself, which really eviscerated his political party. So there we are in 2026 with a president that is almost only dealing with international issues, because those are part of his core competencies and part of where the legitimacy still is strong for the French president, but where his party has much less seats in parliament than the National Rally, for example, and is struggling to govern with a minority government that has to push through legislation using emergency legislative power that allows it to push through legislation without majority. And this is reflected ultimately in those local elections, that this party that was starting to grow, starting to have local legitimacy, has just lost more and more of this legitimacy. You do have the re-election of Édouard Philippe in Le Havre. Édouard Philippe is a potential contender for 2027. He said so, he's running. He just got re-elected, so that's going to give him a boost. You did have Bordeaux, where the centrist candidate won, but at the same time you have François Bayrou, who's an allied of Macron's party, just lost in Pau after his stunt as a prime minister last year. By and large, it feels like a disarray. It might be the only party that has not won in those local elections.
Do you believe that there is a path for Macron's political camp to overcome the crisis, or it's not likely at all at the moment?
What they need is a strong candidate for presidential elections, the same way that Macron was one. But Macron almost invented this movement. So now it's slightly up to him to groom someone, to support someone. No one really wants public support from Emmanuel Macron because he's quite unpopular at the moment. But if he were to support institutionally or support with political power or just grooming someone, I think that would help a lot. And so far, Macron has stayed completely out of this race for reasons that are a bit unknown to the public. He seems reluctant to imagine his own succession. He has mostly got into fights with potential successors. So again, former prime ministers such as Édouard Philippe or Gabriel Attal, who's also the head of his party, those are not anymore in his orbit, and he's not really pushing for their candidacy. This leaves a vacuum, and what we are seeing is sort of another split of the center, going towards center-left, towards center-right, back to their original political parties in many ways. So unless Renaissance and Macron's party were able to just find someone charismatic, and you have less than 6 months to do that, I'm not sure in which state they're going to arrive next year, and they're going to have to count on Républicains or Socialists for their victory.
So before 2027 presidential elections, what is, in your view, the dominant political dynamics? Is it possible the candidate of the left could be there in the second round with a Le Penist candidate?
I think everything is possible at this point. The only thing that's probably impossible would be to not have National Rally in the second round. We know almost for sure that a National Rally candidate will be in the second round. Yet, we have no clue where the challenger would come from. Political forces are telling us that it is possibly the case that a center-right candidate would be strongest. A center-right candidate that is acceptable enough to enough people on the left that it could rally enough votes to get to the second round.
This is the Hungarian case currently. Peter Magyar against Viktor Orban.
That's almost a consensus candidate, a bit like a Macron phenomenon. But the left has also felt, the socialists in particular, they've made a comeback with the latest snap elections, with the European elections. They have charismatic figures such as Raphael Glucksmann. And so they may be tempted to just go at it. And what it would mean is that if you have one or two candidates on the left, 2 or 3 candidates on the right and hard right, center right, the level of access to second round would be much lower. Maybe you just need 15%, 18%. And then in this particular case, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who sits on a reserve vote of hard left voters, which is probably now at 10, 12%, could try to make it to 16% and make it to second round, in which case, against Marine Le Pen or Jordan Bardella, he's in a much weaker position than almost anyone. Today, I would take the bet that no one knows what's going to happen. It is wide open. And if I can add something, we are all in sort of or surprise of how strong the National Rally is. But the National Rally is strong because it is two-headed at the current moment. You have this sort of Janus Roman head thing going on where you have the young person that is attractive to youth and more liberal type of electorate. And you have Marine Le Pen, who's the guarantor of the tradition of Front National, now Rassemblement National, who's reassuring to another type of electorate. Until we don't clarify which one is going to be the candidate, they end up being on top of the polls because no one really has to say which one they prefer. I think the moment when the trial of Marine Le Pen for embezzling European funds ends, which should be at the beginning of July, and once we clarify whether it's her or him leading National Rally next year, I think a lot more things will happen to potentially weaken that candidate, to increase divisions within this camp for the moment, which is very solid, and will allow and give opportunities to maybe some other hard right candidate to emerge, some other centrist right candidate to take on part of that electorate. So a lot will happen.
Well, this sounds like a very, very interesting election, so we'll be watching it closely. Thank you so much for the conversation.
Thank you, Tomasz.
Jakob Ross is a research fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations. Welcome and thank you for talking to us.
Thank you for having me.
In recent years, the AfD, Alternative for Germany, has seemed to be constantly on the rise. The party has just recorded its best ever result in a Western German state, winning roughly 20% of the vote in Rhineland-Palatinate. What do you make of this rise? What does it mean?
Well, I mean, this current electoral cycle in Germany is very interesting. We had the elections in Baden-Württemberg, in another southern state, very industrial, very rich state in Germany. And the fact that the AfD managed to gain 18%, a little more, in this very rich state, I think is a new quality in their rise. It's a new stage. The fact that they can score with an electorate that has been profiting of the globalization for many decades now, that engineers gaining 100,000 euros or more are starting to vote for AfD, I think is a very significant sign for the German political discourse. I think it speaks to the fact that the AfD is tapping into an electorate that is fearful of the future, people who for now, are making good money, having comfortable lives, but increasingly worried for the future of their children, for Germany as an economic market in the world. Rhineland-Palatinate, I think, was similar signals. The AfD had been very active in trying to lobby the electorate with strategic messaging, including in foreign policy. There had been a lot of traveling to the US East Coast. Some of your listeners might know or might not know Rhineland-Palatinate is one of the most important regional states in Germany for US bases. There's a huge amount of US troops stationed still in Rhineland-Palatinate, and the AfD tried to use that as an argument to have good contacts to the Trump administration to score votes. This has been the western part of this electoral cycle, and September we will see 2 or 3 votes: Eastern Germany, Berlin, Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, and Sachsen-Anhalt. Sachsen-Anhalt probably the most important one in the early weeks of September, which will be a very different electorate, which again makes this electoral year of 2026 very interesting to have a look at AfD and foreign policy.
How would you describe the AfD's political profile? Would you say that it is a standard radical right party like many others in Europe, for example, France's National Rally, or is there something specific about the German case that should be noted?
Well, I mean, the first specificity of the German case is the treatment the other parties apply to AfD. radical right-wing parties or extreme right-wing parties have been isolated throughout Europe. I think that's a common point in every European state. But the level of exclusion in Germany is specific. There's tools used by the German government on all levels vis-à-vis AfD that are very specific. German Interior Security Services, Bundesamt für Verfassungsschutz, and the Fundamental Law Protection Service. I don't know if that's a good translation, but that's the sense, essentially. They publish reports on this particular party and have branded them in some parts of Germany as securely extremist, which excludes them from financing mechanism and also brands them in the German public. I think that's a first specific point to understand about how Germany treats the AfD and how the AfD positions itself in the German debate. And the second one, which again I think is a very strong German specificity, is that the AfD has to signal to two very different electorates. Again, in Eastern Germany, traditionally very skeptical of Berlin elites, not feeling part of the narrative that Germany was one of the main profiteers of globalization since the end of the Cold War, feeling left behind. So that's one electorate. And the other one, again, the one that they have been catering to now in Baden-Württemberg or Rhineland-Palatinate, a very different story. And you can see that this has been an increasing problem for the AfD within the party apparatus because they have to cater to these very different electorates. And a third and major difference, I think, if you compare AfD to, say, MSI in Italy or the Rassemblement National in France, is that the perception, but there's good proof for this perception, is that the AfD has been constantly moving right instead of moving to the center, whereas most right-wing populist parties throughout Europe have been trying to make themselves available for right-wing parties to build coalitions, to gain access to government policy. And the AfD very differently has decided, the party leadership has decided to stay on course with this very fundamentalist at times course, and surprisingly has been confirmed by voters since, as you mentioned in the beginning, the AfD has been gaining ground since 2013 when they were first set up.
You've mentioned that they need to appeal to very different electorates. If we take a look at different radical right parties in Europe, they mostly tend to offer some kind of social policy for the people who feel or are materially worse off. It doesn't seem to be the case with AfD. How do you explain this?
I mean, I have to tell you that I'm not an expert on interior policy, mostly on foreign and security policy. I would say that for now, AfD is in the very comfortable position, as might be true for many right-wing parties across Europe, that they have never had to prove themselves in government positions, that they are a 100% populist party for now. And I think the programs reflect that. Many of the programs, be it on the regional level, on the federal level, reflect the fact that they don't have to put numbers to them. They can attack the government for its shortcomings, the bad state of the German economy. But as soon as an AfD leader would be elected in office, and I think Sachsen-Anhalt in this regard will be very interesting in early September because they have a good chance of winning the election, or at least of having a really fundamental position in parliament, in the regional parliament, that many expect these programs to crumble because they don't have detailed ideas on how to finance social programs, on how to signal to the electorate that they can help stabilize the German economy, reposition it in the global economy. But for now, again, it's a very confused and rough and populist program that has never been in the position to really show what it can deliver in office.
One more interesting thing here, especially looking from Warsaw. So, the AfD does not receive much sympathy in Poland. Its representatives' revisionist views on Germany's borders do not sit very well with the Polish voters. But it also seems rather puzzling that the leader of nominally conservative radical right party, Alice Weidel, is an openly lesbian woman married to an immigrant woman and living in Switzerland. In your understanding, how all of this fits into the AfD's political profile? How is it possible to make this a coherent political project?
Well, I think the AfD, and as the party has been growing, this, I think, is a natural process to a certain degree, is an increasingly diverse party with different currents. You have hardcore German nationalists. You reference to them, especially in Eastern Germany, the völkische Flügel, Björn Höcke, for instance. And you have other parts of the party that are much more liberal, pro-American, pro-business. I would count Alice Weidel in that camp. And this goes with, I think, a broad spectrum of social policies, of how frame themselves as conservative, modern conservative politicians, same-sex marriage, being in a relationship with a woman of immigrant descent, living outside of Germany, having this cosmopolitan lifestyle to a certain degree. That's another fault line for the party, because I think that presidency of the party, Alice Weidel, on one side, on one hand, and Tino Kropala on the other one, is again witnessing to the fact that the party tries to signal to both all camps within its ranks, and that it's increasingly difficult going to this electoral cycle with very different electorates throughout Germany.
Germany is now on track to rapidly increase its military capabilities. Does Germany's military buildup affect right-wing politics in the country? Is it a factor in any way?
I discussed with several defense politicians or politicians of the AfD sitting in the defense committee, and they unanimously and very openly talked about the fact that it's difficult for them to see their wishes come true, being implemented by the current government and even the government before through the term of Zeitenwende. The fact that AfD has been rooting for a stronger German military for many years, effectively since the beginning, and that this is now being implemented by conservatives, by the Social Democrats, but also by traditionally pacifist forces in German politics like the Green Party. I think that's a problem for the party. And again, you have a very clear-cut fault line with Western German politicians, many on the defense committee being former soldiers that were socialized during the Cold War, often trained in the US or in NATO institutions, so very pro-Western, very pro-US. And on the other hand, a more pacifist Eastern German electorate, and also the politicians, people like Björn Höcke, who are very reluctant, for instance, to reintroduce military service in Germany, the positioning of mid-range American missiles that has been discussed for years now. And so again, you have to find a middle way to a certain degree between these enthusiasts of a stronger, more independent, but also Germany being part of NATO and the Western camp, and on the other hand, the pacifist side that wants the Americans out, that wants to renegotiate terms with Russia, that is very reluctant to condemn Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. And I think these different camps still exist and fight for power and influence within AfD.
Well, in Poland, the general view of Germany's military buildup is, I think, rather positive. But I think that there is a question in the back of the head of a Polish analyst. If this buildup happens and then AfD takes hold of power, what's the significance of that?
The real problem hovering above these European debates, I think I see them since I'm working on France a lot in France, because again, the French military in general sees the military build-up and the strengthening of German capacities very positively, has been demanding that for many years, but at the same time looks at the polls and sees that the far right is rising, and it doesn't take a lot of imagination to see a situation.
So this is a problem.
That this is a problem, I think, throughout Europe, where you have several European member states that are engaged in this military build-up, at the same time have forces gaining power or gaining votes, at least, that have a revisionist view of European relations. So yes, I think it will be very important for Germany, maybe for AfD, if they continue to rise in Germany, to signal to European partners that there's no need to fear the military build-up, which I think in the German example is not happening at all. But again, referring to initial expertise, Franco-German relations, I see the Rassemblement National engaging in this process very actively and signaling to European partners that they will be responsible in office, that there won't be any reasons to fear Rassemblement National at the head of the French state. And I think the AfD eventually, again, if they continue to rise in the ranks, will do the same towards partners like France or Poland.
I'd like to ask you, what do you make of the response of the mainstream parties and public institutions to the AfD's rise? You've mentioned the existing firewall preventing mainstream parties from cooperating with the AfD. You've also mentioned this federal intelligence agency labeling the AfD as extremist, which has been contested in court. Yet none of this seems to be stopping the AfD from actually growing. Why is this?
Well, I mean, the first answer is that as long as a majority of the German electorate gets the sense that nothing is getting better, with regards to the economic situation, with regards to interior security, then many people will continue and more people will continue to vote for AfD just to protest, essentially. That's a very important first point. And in Berlin, many people will tell you that the best way to fight AfD and the rise of AfD is to deliver good policy, which is a very simple truth and easily said, but has not been happening so far, apparently. The second point is that the Brandmauer strategy, firewall strategy, is really a high-risk strategy. It's a win-or-lose strategy because it prevents AfD to, build networks, be it in Berlin or in the country with right-wing parties, say, to establish contacts and to do what other right-wing parties across Europe have essentially achieved, looking at the Rassemblement National in France again. But at the same time, you risk a situation where a majority of the electorate is on the other side of the firewall and you are standing with a minority on the right side, so to say, of history, posing very fundamental questions about democracy, majority rule. And I think that an increasing part of the German public debate, political decision makers, are conscious about these risks. There's two conversations now, I would say, in Germany. The public conversation, which still very much insists on this dogmatic approach of the firewall, and then a closed-door conversation where many people are questioning this. And to me, that's my personal view, it's an increasing problem that these conversations are being held behind closed doors because you hear them everywhere, but not in the public space, which again, for democracy, I think is a problem.
So what's the argument here, if you could describe it briefly?
Well, many within the Conservative Party, for instance, CDU or CSU in Bavaria, arguing that the strategy of the Brandmauer, dogmatic Brandmauer, has failed, that recent votes of the EPP with right-wing fractions in the European Parliament are signaling that this might be a better strategy to accept votes from the growing extreme right, to push projects where the right and the extreme right are basically on the same terms. Some in Germany and some public, but again, that's a minority movement arguing for minority governments. Say in the Sachsen-Anhalt election in September, if the AfD manages to gain, 38-39% of the vote, can't get into office, that the CDU or another political force will claim the state government, but will depend on votes from the AfD to push through projects in parliament that a majority of the voters want without, again, getting AfD into government, strictly speaking. But it's a highly controversial position, a debate that is still marked by many taboos due to German history, to Nazism, to the rise of Adolf Hitler and the NSDAP through parliamentary elections to power. But again, the debate is definitely shifting, and I think these regional elections in Eastern Germany, in Sachsen-Anhalt first and then in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, will have an impact and will potentially change the view of and the tactics of conservative parties with regards to the AfD.
How likely do you think is the scenario in which the AfD gains a share of power at the federal level? When could this happen, and what would need to happen for it to become a reality?
That's pure speculation, but a very common speculation is that if the Conservative Party and the CDU mainly chooses to get into coalitions against the AfD after the regional elections in Eastern Germany, meaning they would cooperate with left-wing extremist elements. Die Linke is also labeled as extremists in some parts of the German public debate, that this would lead to the implosion of the Conservative Party, basically, with many members, leaving the party, maybe joining ranks with AfD, which then I think would trigger broader movement throughout Germany eventually. Again, all this under the assumption that, the recession is not ending, that Germans in majority do not have the impression that the government finds ways to reform the system, to provide for a positive narrative for Germany and the European Union going forward. But if that's the case, I think that these regional elections will be tipping points in this development on the right, because many people in the CDU, again, if you talk to them behind closed doors, fully aware of the trap they are in, because they can only get into left-wing coalitions now, either with the SPD, Social Democrats, or the Green Party. another right-wing party, the Liberals, have basically been eliminated in these past elections and do not play a significant role on the federal level. So the CDU is again and again forced into coalitions against their reform program, against their nature, if you will. And this can only last so long and eventually will implode this Conservative Party, as has been happening, and that's the warning, last point, in other European states. Look at the Conservative Party in France, in Italy to a certain degree.
Very important to watch what will happen in the autumn. Thank you so much for the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you for being with us. We invite you to listen to all 5 special episodes of the Polityka Insight podcast recorded at the Warsaw European Conversation 2026.